me give you some sobering statistics, and this is my final submission. We have over 8 million Ugandan children who enter primary school education. By the time they get to secondary school, we have about 2 million. From secondary school, we have about 260,000. That's only 3% from the 80 million who enter university. I'm not saying every Ugandan should go to university, but we must have a system that enables individuals to be skilled appropriately to innovate and work and contribute to the economy. The economy cannot grow by itself. It requires enabled human capital.
Do you aspire for a booming middle-class economy? Listen along to understand what turns the wheels of Uganda's economy with our line of incredible influencers in their fields.
Today we are very excited to be hosting a professor, a doctor, Miss Rose Nanyonga Clark. She is the Vice Chancellor at Clark International University, and she's very passionate about higher education. She's passionate about healthcare, most of the things that are actually going to drive us into a middle-class economy. She has been globally hosted, and I just haven't had you speak about your other passion about ending child sacrifice. And I remember growing up in the 90s, hearing stories about people being sacrificed and children being kidnapped. Some parents had to prick their boys' ears, which is not common for boys. I thought this is probably something we can start with. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you
on
very
Uganda.
much. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
You are such a woman of many firsts.
Thank
You wear
you.
so many hats. You sit on a board. You sit with so many different higher level institution leaders. That is really commendable. Now, ending child sacrifice. What was it like before? So if you can take us back to the 90s as compared to today.
Depending on where you grew up, as Ugandans, you have varied experiences. I grew up in Kono area, Bamunanika, Luwero. My father was a clinical officer and he traveled widely. So we landed and spent a majority of my early years in Bamunanika. It's about 16 kilometers or less off of Luwero, Wobulenzi town. In my family, my great-grandparents really believed and practiced witchcraft to some degree. That's not uncommon, I think, for many African families, Ugandan families. It's not something we regularly talk about. There's always shame and silence around it. Even persons that you meet in the church on Sunday morning probably spend a couple of nights somewhere, in a sabo, as they called them, before they come to church. So there's always been that sort of shared and fluidity, people moving from the traditional beliefs of worship to the conventional church streams, and the degree of comfort for people to do that. I learned about child sacrifice, of course, as part of that. And I think sometimes when people talk about child sacrifice, they relegate the understanding of that to just the killing child. But really, there's a wide spectrum of what that constitutes, from miming children, taking body parts of children, and so on and so forth. It doesn't necessarily often end in the demise of a child, but it does end in long-term impact, either psychologically or physically. In the 90s, and also actually much more in early 2000, I think Uganda started being maybe a lot more connected. Communication channels started improving to where people would have phones. We've progressed a lot from those big phones we used to have. Exactly. So the country started getting a lot more connected, so you could hear more reports of these instances happening in villages and so on. In 2009, because of my background and knowledge and being so closely connected to those practices, I started a grassroots campaign. It was actually quite extensive, involving everybody, including members of parliament, the First Lady, anybody we could get in front of, to raise awareness about practices associated with witchcraft and particularly child sacrifice, and interest the government to come up with some framework to support maybe into the existing laws to amplify the protection of children. At that time, a major report had been published that chronicled several children being sacrificed or mined through rituals at home, either given up by their own parents or kidnapped by other people from the village. There was widespread information about the issue, and I thought we could leverage those data coming out of this report to actually draw your attention to the issue, raise a degree of consciousness about it. And I used my story to underpin that. So it was quite personal, because before I met my Irish parents, I had walked nearly 52 kilometers from my home village in Bamnanika all the way to Chiwoko, where Dr. Ian Clark was based at that time. This was in the late 1990s. I was a teenager at that time. So I used that trip and I said, why don't we trace my journey from Bamnanika to Chiwoko and then involve people to join me in walking in solidarity, and then use that to really gain support. We even wrote a petition to members of parliament and had over 140 members signing to try and end child sacrifice.
I really like how you actually used your story to bring awareness to a specific action, because I feel like so many of these paradigms are not well explained. People just think that our tradition was so bad. There's some things about our tradition that are good, but
Absolutely.
like you rightly say, the effect of child sacrifice can lead to a long suffering.
Absolutely.
So if it has then that connotation, then why not end it in that regard?
I think there are so many layers to the traditions that shaped our upbringing. A lot of positive things. Sometimes when I tell my story, growing up in poverty, I used to think, this is the worst thing that could happen to you. But okay, I look back now and I think I have such excellent values around work. My work ethic is excellent. That doesn't just grow. You simply don't wake up and have that kind of fire system.
I like that you came really early.
So those experiences of my upbringing have worked out in such a way that I lean into that. I worked really hard, I struggled, I grew in terms of resilience. I never believed anything is possible if you really, put your mind to it. And I'm not saying that to be flippant about the things we suffer and the struggles that young people encounter every single day. When I walked back to Chiwoko, that's a long time to walk. You start the trip at 6 o'clock in the morning and it takes you almost all day. You arrive about 4 or 5 p.m. That's how long it takes to walk over 46 to 50 kilometers. I was so determined at that time, and I'm still determined in different ways. Let me come to the end of that story of child sacrifice. The result of that campaign is that in the end we ended up having almost what now they call Sauti lines was established, so that anyone in the country, if you saw something, if you heard something, if you even suspicious a child has been kidnapped and is being subjected to these rituals, you could call that line, and then the police was involved. Several other organizations were established to continue to pursue the agenda. And then for me, it sort of formed the initial organization I set up to include nurses who can promote nurse-led interventions, because nurses are your first line providers. They are the majority of the healthcare providers. Any Ugandan, if they walk into a clinic, they walk into a hospital, even if they've not seen anybody else, they are likely to encounter a nurse. And I thought that nurses could be that first line.
Wait a minute. Do you know what it will take for Uganda to achieve a middle-class economy by 2040? Please send us an email at onuganda@gmail.com.
Get a child who has been mimed. They are able to take a comprehensive history of what has occurred and then escalate that to the necessary channels. We don't have such a large social support circle. We don't have social workers here. We do have some, but not as many as we ought to have. And that work has taken on a life of its own. I no longer talk a lot about child sacrifice, but I'm still committed to the issues that impact young people and the youth in the country, and to figuring out how every individual in Uganda, placed wherever they are able to leverage what they have to address those issues.
I also like that your approach to ending child sacrifice brings us to education.
Absolutely.
And believe it or not, some nurses could be young, some nurses could be old. We have also seen that in your passion when we prepared for this episode. Today's daily paper had an interesting topic titled "No Money for Districts to Hire Health Workers." I've also read a few headlines where health workers are not prioritized in that regard. We've seen a few health workers being arrested as they demonstrate and advocate for what really matters. We believe in the middle class economy. Healthcare is key. One of our recent guests told us some of us are one healthcare emergency away from poverty. And that really stuck home. I'm very privileged because one of my first insurance was at IHK. I have a skin disorder, psoriasis. You go over there and the service you get is just fantastic. There'll be people who never get to experience that because of the different social classes. But what is it for you that you see if you had power to change one thing about our healthcare? Because you are in academia, but you're also a certified professional nurse, teach policy and planning.
Yes, I do.
But if you had that magical stick, what would you change?
I think that I would invest in innovations that drive the cost of care down so that you can amplify access. It's critically important because the things that you enjoy, if you want to have a mammogram, let me use specific examples for young people that they can understand. We encourage a lot of young women in their 20s to start self-breast exams. These are things that you can do at home to identify and see if there are lumps growing in your breast. And then if they discover that lump, they need to access a healthcare provider, a clinic, a hospital. When they get there, the second level of screening ought to be a mammogram. Beyond the clinician examining you head to toe, doing the same thing you've been doing at home, the next level is a mammogram. How many mammograms do we have in the country?
I don't know.
Exactly.
How many do we have?
Very few, I believe. Maybe not more than 5. Don't quote me on it, because we can count how many places you can go to actually have a mammogram in this country. Maybe you can get one at IHK, maybe you can get one at the Cancer Institute, but you certainly will not have it if you're somewhere in Luero, in Arua. The cost of delivering that care is so expensive. We have to import everything in this country that we need to be able to look after our people. So for me, it's the age of innovation, it's the 4th industrial revolution. Is there a way we can begin to invest in local innovation through appropriate research and Development, focused on how do we make healthcare accessible. We know that healthcare is going to cost something. We train and invest a lot of money in training specialists, doctors and nurses. They are not going to be working for free. So it's a business industry. How do we ensure that a Ugandan like me who grew up in the village, I walk to the clinic and I'm able to get the pills, the sundries and all other resources. So I know that maybe people are expecting a completely different answer, but knowing that I work in hospitals where syringes, needles, gloves, everything that we use, majority of those items are not made in Uganda. We don't have the infrastructure, the capacity of the industry to produce and reproduce, at quality levels. We are relying on the produce of all of that externally. And that has a cost attached to it. By the time you calculate all of that cost and all the markup and begin to now say, for me to give you an injection of chloroquine, including medications, I believe the government is working really hard to turn things around through establishing pharmaceutical companies, getting patent rights to certain things to draw that price down. And this is critical because a wealthy Ugandan is able to work hard to get into the middle class economy that we are talking about. If you have a population that is not healthy, then that's the start, that's the basic Maslow's hierarchy, as we call it. A Ugandan who is not well, who is not healthy, is not going to be a productive member of the society. So we need to be able to solve that piece for us to solve the other piece.
From where you sit, you teach policy, you teach planning. I wonder if you only think investment is the only challenge.
But I was answering just one thing I would do.
Okay.
It's not necessarily the only challenge.
Yeah. Where are the opportunities? The entrepreneurs who are going into it to make impact with whatever innovation they have, you rub shoulders with policymakers themselves.
Right. Yes.
Where do you see the opportunity or the gap?
I think one of the things we need to think about, because I don't want to bring a regurgitated response to this conversation.
Yeah.
One of the things we needed to think about is how to move innovative ideas and solutions from silos to meaningful, intentional, integrated, collaborative work. When you have an industry developing some machine that they want the government to pay for later on without the government being at the table, I think we've spent a lot of conversations, time talking about building synergy, the industry, private partnerships with government partnerships. And sometimes it feels like it's a conversation we have, but it's not a conversation we are willing to act on. Because in the end, people sort of go back and they start doing their own thing. It's critically important that universities, for example, develop a new model of meaningful engagement with the industry. If the industry is willing to invest in research and development, then the university is coming along to support the knowledge development, the knowledge management, the research itself, because that's the expertise we bring. The person who is trying to dismantle a phone so that they can recreate something new, they have the technical expertise perhaps. But that needs to work together in a way that is not cost prohibitive.
What is the practical example?
A practical example is a few years ago I met a young lady who was working on developing a system for IV fluids, an infusion pump that delivers IV fluids. So when you are in motor vehicle accident and you enter into the hospital and you don't have water, you've lost blood volume. One way to rapidly support and recover the patient is by pushing body fluids. no saline, sugar related, all of that. The infusion pumps we have in this country are all imported. This young lady was trying to work with a team to actually develop that locally using local resources and so on and so forth. And so the part of what we came together to discuss was, okay, bring healthcare providers who know about infusion pump, bring academicians into the room, bring IT developers and other technical developers so that all of those brains are at the table. Now, there are limitations, of course. People begin to talk about intellectual property rights, patent rights, and so on. You want to guard your idea because you don't want other people to steal it. So there are limitations, and how those can be overcome, certainly. What I know is that kind of ecosystem model is really needed, either through appropriate memorandums of understanding that amplify the contractual obligations of each party as they come together to do that. But if we continue to do things in isolation, then it's very difficult for healthcare systems to begin to change towards what the market is doing or bringing to the table. You sell something to me and I purchase it and you look for the highest bidder.
No, Professor, I'm curious. Was she able to get people to work together?
Flipper. And her name is, she's brilliant. I haven't actually contacted her after COVID-19 to see, how far she's gone. I can follow up and see, because she was on to something.
Like you rightly say, people are actually doing their best, but then you say the action. We're not acting.
Yeah.
So why do you think we're not acting?
I think part of it is risk taking, the appetite for risk. We have grown up in an economy where if you have money, you want to hold on to it.
Stacks of cash in the house.
Well, if you can hold on to it at all, you know the regular saying, each middle class individual has at least 6 to 8 households that are dependent on that individual. The moment you get your paycheck, everybody lines up. The risk, I think, for investing money, being willing to lose all of it, quite often a lot of people have zero access to funding for the ideas that they have. That's one thing I would really like to recommend. The biggest bottleneck for anybody who has brilliant ideas often comes down to funding to advance their ideas. So they go through multiple ideas every year and they abandon even the good ideas. Either they don't have the audience, they don't have the platform, they don't have the funding, or simply we exist within a market that is not responsive enough to pick up those ideas.
And at Clark University, training your young professionals or youth to actually be ready for markets.
We are trying.
You're doing a good job. I always talk about on this podcast. The level of analysis or the level of freedom you're given to analyze subject matter is just amazing. In my time at Makerere University, we did a lot of presentations in front of the class, but it wasn't the same as going out, reading journal articles, being up to date with the news and watching the BBC. So when I read this about Clark University, I was quite excited. Tell us about the few innovations from your university that have really impressed you in that regard, because you're well-traveled, you've seen it all.
Well, I think Clark International University grew out of a need to make a difference to the way healthcare providers were being trained. If you look at our history, in 2003, International Hospital was established in Nanyonga. When it was constituted as a hospital, one of the needs we had was to establish international standards. By that I mean ISO certified standards within the region, but also internationally. We also wanted to develop Ugandans. We didn't want to hire Kenyans, bless the Kenyans. We didn't want to hire people from within the region or externally from other countries. We wanted to hire Ugandans to run the hospital. But our problem, we hired a lot of nurses. We had about 120 at that time. I'm sure the number has grown, not just for the hospital, but all the clinics we were setting up, several doctors and specialists. And we started seeing gaps in their level of competencies. So that's where we thought, okay, let's set up a training program. Initially, I was part of designing the programs to brush up on the skills of all the health professionals we had in the system. And then that idea birthed another idea, and eventually the university was established. This was about 16 years ago. The ethos of why the university was established was to really make a difference, to develop global healthcare leaders who could solve problems, make a difference in the way healthcare delivery was being given, innovate through their practices and their ideas and so on. And that also informed how we designed the curriculum, but not just the design of it, but also how the curriculum was delivered, with a huge emphasis on experiential learning. Currently, we sign lots of memorandums of understanding and insist that 60% of the students' learning, whether they are doctors or nurses, has to occur in a clinical setting, not in a classroom setting. It has to be either through simulated learning or hands-on in the hospital, being monitored, learning to be a safe practitioner. So we continue to drive that agenda. I'm really confident of the products we put out on the market. Yeah. And of course, we've had growth evolutions of ideas. A few years ago, we started a program for anti-innovators in the country, which was funded largely through the Norwegian Development Agency. And then that birthed the Refactory Academy, which is currently ongoing, led by Mike Tegeka. He's a brilliant gentleman who is really carrying forward the agenda. This program is focused on the skilling of the youth in Uganda with necessary market-driven skills. We know that the market is demanding persons with digital skills, competences, information technology, and so on. But the program doesn't just focus on the technical bits, it also focuses on their capacity to grow as leaders who are going to make decisions. For me, being in education is about producing an individual who can solve the next problem. Maybe the one thing that opportunities in the education sector, everybody is talking about AI. Without the associated infrastructure, then it remains just a conversation.
And we can hear your passion, the way you're delivering it. We can tell that you're committed to continuous learning.
Well,
about innovation, e-learning, technology. For that one listener who is tuned in today, what has been your life's journey lesson that you want someone to take from this conversation?
My personal life journey. I always say, what would I tell my 16-year-old where to look back? I probably would say everything is going to be okay. But it's very difficult to know that when you are 16 and struggling, or when you are 15 or 18 and making a difficult decision about, do I go to university? Do I not? Or you really want to go to university but you can't because of your circumstances. But my life has been defined by a single belief that if you're going to fall forward, at least that's a movement. And falling backwards is not a useful strategy. It puts you so many steps backwards. So if you're going to fall forward, and by that I mean that life is not going to be easy. There are going to be challenges, there are going to be barriers, there are life events so catastrophic that an individual finds it very difficult to even get up and move forward. All of the things are going to be there, but it's really important to have a faith that a new day is going to come.
I love that. Is that the same faith you take to the boardrooms? You're shattering the ceilings, you're shattering.
Absolutely. Different levels of leadership. Don't be static. Take one step at a time. We are not going to save the world in one day. Our grandparents say a man does not eat an elephant in one go. A man eats an elephant one piece at a time. If you look at it as a huge elephant, well, you're going to be overwhelmed. You're like, oh my gosh, you know. But if I'm looking at just one piece, then I'm going to work at that. So one step at a time, I think is a great philosophy. We can achieve so much if we are able to focus.
Okay, so I'm afraid that's all the time we had for. We have a final question. We ask every guest that comes onto this podcast. Are you ready, Professor?
I think so.
What is it going to take for Uganda to achieve a middle class economy? You've talked about all these issues in healthcare, education, and child sacrifice. But in your opinion, what do you think it's going to take for it to achieve that middle class economy? Because the World Bank projects that Uganda is going to achieve a middle class economy by 2040. So we want leaders like you. We want leaders like you to share with us how will you get there, and if we get there, can we thrive while we're there?
I think so. I think we can thrive. The one thing that defines who we are as a people is that we are resilient. I believe in Ugandans. I believe in their capacity to be resilient.
I feel like resilience and what you just said earlier, risk taker, don't go well together. Sometimes I feel we're resilient, but then I also believe in what you said earlier. If you look at the people who demonstrate on the streets of Kampala as compared to Kenya, then you really see resilience in Kenya.
I think we need to invest better in our people. We are not investing enough in our people. You need human capital, not machines and other things, to take you to middle class. You cannot say we want a middle class economy without investing in people. Let me give you some sobering statistics, and this is my final submission. We have over 8 million Ugandan children who enter primary school education. By the time they get to secondary school, we have about 2 million. From secondary school, we have about 260,000. That's only 3% from the 80 million who enter university. I'm not saying every Ugandan should go to university, but we must have a system that enables individuals to be skilled appropriately, to innovate and contribute to the economy. The economy cannot grow by itself. It requires enabled human capital. We are not investing enough, and I really want to call, and this is not just a call to the government, it's a call to every parent, to every Ugandan, to every organization who is really interested. Let's not simply have a conversation about this. Intentionality is important. Where are you putting your money? Of all of those 8 million kids, how many are we able to?
Yeah. There was also a recent guest on the podcast calling upon parents. It's not the government's role to help your children learn how to count. But then in my head, I also think that if their parents do know how to count,
it's a vicious cycle. True, but I think we can come up with models that can help. There are so many things we can do, but I'm an educator, so I go to what I know best, which is educate, keep everybody healthy. Ugandans will work, and maybe work on the work ethic.
Absolutely, the work ethic would be a couple episode for another day. But thank you so much. Like I keep saying, I finish conversations with leaders like yourself, I'm just blown away at how amazing Ugandans can be. If we have people like you who are educating us, then the sky is on the limit. So thank you so much for being a guest.
And I want to invite you.
I have a friend who does rock climbing.
Oh yes.
And so please, if you ever want to go rock climbing, I guess that is what would bring me to climbing first.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening in this far. I really hope that this conversation was helpful to you. Share this episode with your colleagues or friends that you think will benefit from this information. Let them know what you're listening to. Would you also rate our podcast? Because once you rate our podcast, other people like you are able to listen to this information and use it to their own benefit. On a lighter note, follow us on TikTok and Instagram. Would really like to hear your thoughts.